My presentation on synchronous discussions is going to be a lot shorter than my presentation on asynchronous discussions because the general rule of thumb I would use is that synchronous discussions online should proceed as closely as possible to the discussions that you would have in a normal classroom. And it's quite possible to come pretty close using the tools that are available. So really with synchronous discussions, the big thing that you have to worry about is becoming comfortable enough with the tools that you use so that they do not get in the way. So in terms of what we'll cover in the presentation, let's start with the definition. And synchronous discussions are simply discussions that proceed in the same way that a normal classroom discussion would proceed, which is to say in real time. And normally we'll be using a tool that has the ability to support audio chat so that you're talking back and forth the same way you do in a classroom. Now, you may or may not be able to use video channels such as webcams. That depends on a lot of things like the tool and the bandwidth available. But really the ability to have audio is the most important thing. I find it very, very difficult to conduct synchronous discussions using text chat where everyone's texting each other back and forth. That was the way we used to do it maybe 20 years ago, but I'm a really lousy typist, so that put me at a huge disadvantage, so I won't do it. So I need an audio tool. We'll talk a little bit about the tool. I'll give a brief demonstration of it. A demonstration that I created after almost 10 minutes of exposure to it. So it's not very in-depth, but it'll just show you a little bit about what to expect from the instructor's side. I will talk a little bit about how you may want to set up such a conference situation and how you might conduct the discussion where it's similar and different to a regular classroom. And the answer here is it's a lot more similar than it is different. Quickly, let's consider some of the elements of a synchronous discussion and what you need to be thinking about as an instructor. First, there is the context of these discussions. Unlike asynchronous, you need a class period for synchronous discussions. It is extremely difficult to schedule such instructions if you've got students all over the place, and I know I've tried. They are, however, place agnostic, though again that might depend a little bit on where your students are located. There are just going to be some locations that will not support the level of internet connectivity you need for audio bandwidth, and in that case you're much better just sticking with asynchronous discussions. And then there's the issue of class size, and in a synchronous discussion, you're probably better with slightly smaller classes. The tools will handle a lot of people. I think your tool, lists up to 500 people GoToWebinar. So you could have an extremely large discussion, but then you're not really going to have a discussion. You're more going to have a lecture with questions. Next thing we might want to think about is the tools. Conferencing tools. I originally thought you were going to use GoToMeeting, and I didn't change the slide. Actually, I think you're using GoToWebinar, which is a similar tool made by Citrix. Normally, you have a shared whiteboard. In the case of GoToWebinar, you share your desktop, which means that you need some sort of tool that you can type in if you want to make comments on the board while people are talking in the case. And a lot of the tools have chat. GoToWebinar actually seems to separate out the chat channels in a sense. You have a question channel the students can pose questions in, and then there's a chat channel where you broadcast out to the people in the webinar. So it's not quite as interactive as some of the chat tools you see in other conferencing. But what you need to be aware of is that when you've got a text channel, such as the questions channel, you want to attend to it or have somebody attend to it while the discussion's going on, because a lot of times you will find interesting stuff going on in those channels. The conduct of these things is very similar to the classroom. I like to use a pre-case question to sort of set up the class, and I'll talk about that shortly. You can have some parallelism in the sense that what goes on in text doesn't always match the audio. And there are some conferencing tools that allow you to set up separate rooms so you could actually have separate discussions going on, but you can't be in more than one room at a time listening to a discussion. So from your perspective, it's going to be very serial in its conduct, just as would be the case in a classroom. Finally, we might want to talk a little bit about assessment. I use the same tools for assessing cases in the classroom and on synchronous discussions, and I use the same post-case reflection that I talked about for the asynchronous class, which asks the two questions, what are the three most important things you learned from the case, and how did the discussion change your mind about the case? I think those questions are almost universally valuable whenever you've had a discussion about a case. So I've mentioned this notion of a pre-case question several times, and it really is an alternative to what a lot of faculty do, which is having a written case analysis prepared by each student. The problem I have with a written case analysis prepared for each case is it tends to produce a lot of relatively superficial analysis that the students don't want to write and the faculty don't want to read. But it does have the virtue of making sure that the students have at least looked at the case in a semi-careful way before coming into a discussion. Now at HBS, we never had to do written case analyses except during the final exams. The dreaded WACs got phased out a few years before I arrived. But the reason that we prepared each case, or at least one of the important reasons why I prepared each case, was this notion of a cold call. Well, you could do cold calls in a synchronous discussion, and I have, but the problem is as classes get larger, some people will play the numbers game, and the cold call will not induce sufficient fear to get them to prepare carefully. So what I do is effectively give everybody a cold call. I give them a question that they need to answer in a very short period of time at the beginning of the class. I normally give them like 20 to 25 minutes to answer, and they have to upload it to the learning management system. And the question is always one that requires some thoughtful analysis of the case, not just looking up facts. So I won't ask them, a question like, what industry is this company in, or something like that, which they couldn't answer if they actually hadn't looked at the case. But I would ask a question like, well, what should this manager do? In fact, that's the most common question I have. If there's a decision involved, I would say, what is your recommendation and why? And that basically is a very hard thing to come up with an answer with in 20 minutes if you have not read the case. I do this in my classes, and I also do it online. Online, in some respects, it's easier because you already know that they're going to be on the computer. They can't say, oh, I forgot to bring in my computer today or something like that, or my battery's dead. If they're online for your session, then they can upload it. So it means the first 20 minutes of the session, you're basically sitting there while people write, not doing anything. The other advantage of this is that you always give it immediately upon the time the class is supposed to start. If somebody comes in late, it simply means that they've got less time to fill it in. And one of the things that does is it tends to really encourage punctuality in the classes without getting all nasty when folks come in late. You just say, oh, well, you came in 15 minutes late, so you're going to have to do this in 5 minutes, and leave it at that. And as I say, it tends to encourage punctuality. It also is a nice complement to those post-case questions I was talking about, because you can literally look at these things and see whether the students are telling the truth about how their opinion changed as a result of the discussion, because you're really doing a pre and a post test. What's your thought about the case before the discussion begins, and what's your thoughts about the case after the discussion begins? Finally, I think the high-level question is probably the best type of question to ask. So, for example, for the for actually both the cases that I'm using in the workshop, if you were Grandin, how would you choose to proceed given the circumstances at the end of the case? Well, that actually applies to both of those cases because I'm the protagonist in both. And a question like this essentially forces the students to really have thought about things if they're going to give any kind of reasonable answer. And almost any good discussion case, which is based around a decision, naturally offers these questions. And of course, students will realize you're going to ask a question like this. So when they're preparing the case, they're going to focus on what they would make as a decision. And ironically, that's exactly what you want them to focus on. You don't want them to focus on preparing an in-depth history of the case that goes through all the case facts. You want them to be able to create an argument for a particular decision. So the technology that INCAE is preferring to use for these online discussions is GoToWebinar. And now that I have actually spent 30 minutes looking at the technology this morning, I am naturally an expert in it. Not. But the key elements of this technology, and pretty much any conferencing technology you're likely to use for case discussions, are a shared audio channel so that everybody can hear everyone else talk. And what my experience has been is you almost always have a few problems when you use these technologies with a group of students. I would find typically 1 in 5 students has problems. That number is getting a little better over time because so many students now use laptops with integrated webcams and audio. So as a consequence, you don't have to deal with all the microphone setup problems that you used to. But you'll always find that there are some problems. So I usually like to have at least one session that is just there for people to set up and test their connections. And the quality of the audio can depend a lot on the bandwidth and the connection. And I've had students, for example, coming in from India, from villages where they're using sort of a cellular connection, and that, is not necessarily going to be good enough. So if you're allowing people without good connections to participate in your course, then once again you may want to rethink reliance on synchronous or make your synchronous discussions optional. Another thing they will have is a shared whiteboard, or in the case of GoToWebinar, a shared desktop. I have to admit I slightly prefer a shared whiteboard because it usually has nice tools for writing and talking. I tend to use a tablet PC when I am doing these synchronous discussions, and that allows me to actually write on my computer, handwriting just the way I would on a whiteboard, and that I find is very natural. When you have to type while students are talking, just to take notes, you might want to think about having a teaching assistant or even a student in the role of note taker so that you can actually listen to what's going on. Part of my attitude towards that is based upon what a lousy typist I am, as I've mentioned probably 3 or 4 times over the course of these presentations. You have a question window, which basically creates a new channel, a text channel, where students can enter things in. And it can be quite a distraction. But I'll tell you, the question window is probably nowhere near the kind of distraction that you have when you have a full text going on, a full text chat. I recall one case discussion where I had a visitor in from the company sitting in on this synchronous discussion. We were all over the place, and 2 students were having what they thought was a private discussion on Battlestar Galactica, but as a moderator I could see the discussion, as could our guest, and the guest thought it was absolutely hilarious, but clearly these people were not focused on the case discussion. And that's the problem with the text window, is when they type something in a text window, they expect that you're looking at it, whereas a lot of times you're concentrating on writing on the board and stuff like that, and you just don't see what's going on. So it's probably a good idea to have someone there to alert you, and it could be another student just if things are coming in. Some facilitators like to turn the thing off. I prefer to leave it open, even though it is a disadvantage for me, because you'll always end up having 1 or 2 students who, for some reason, cannot connect with the audio channel but can get the video and the text. And so in that case, they may be able to hear you, but they can't use their microphone, and then the text becomes the only way they can communicate. And I can't imagine anything more frustrating than communicating without without the ability to speak. Another thing about this is you can actually record these sessions. Virtually all these tools allow you to record the synchronous session that goes on, and that can be a nice substitute for attendance if someone has something that they simply cannot break away from. And that, once again, is something that's quite possible if you bill a course as an online asynchronous course. You may find scheduling these things to be a real problem. I certainly have. So here I'm going to just demonstrate briefly the way you might set up a case discussion. I'm assuming all of you know how to click the link to get to GoToWebinar, and you may have to download some software if you haven't used GoToWebinar before. I did the first time I did this. And so when GoToWebinar opens, you get a screen, something like this. The first thing that you may want to do is to share your webcam as an instructor. So I am sharing my webcam now, and you can see the webcam image here. Then what I find when I'm conducting a case discussion is I like to have somewhere to take notes. Now, that like a whiteboard or a chalkboard that you might use over the course of an actual case discussion. So what I'm going to do in this case is share my screen and open a PowerPoint. So what I will do is I will just open PowerPoint here, and I'll use the blank presentation since that will give me a reasonable slide. I will go to my layout and just choose like a title and content so I can put in bullet points. I will increase the size of the window. Maybe I guess I'll move over this thing over to the side. So now I've got an area where at least students can see, and then they can hide the webcam of me if they want to, because there's really not that much to see there, but sometimes it's a good way of conveying facial information. So I would put notes here. Now, I am the world's worst typist. You might end up in a case discussion actually assigning a student to just put outline notes, or if you have a co-instructor, you could do that, because while you're typing and talking, it can be hard. But when you're listening to students, it's just like using a whiteboard. As you do this, you need to show your screen. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to show the screen here, and this is this thing here, and the clean screen gets rid of some of the icons and stuff like that that might be hard to say. So as the discussion progresses, you're going to have this collection of names, and I find it's much better if people can actually talk. You can undock this because in a large class, you're likely to have quite a few attendees. And obviously you can, as the number of attendees grows, this window is going to grow as well. If you have a couple of monitors, which I do, you could in fact drag the participant window over to another monitor. But one of the things you have to remember if you're using a webcam is if you have two monitors and you've got a webcam, and unless the monitors are stacked right on top of each other, every time you use the other window or look at it, you're going to appear to be staring away. So if I move that list over to another window, as I did right now, then to see it, I'm going to have to stare like this. And under those circumstances, if you're going to be doing that a lot, you might want to turn off your webcam, because it might make the students very suspicious about the fact that you don't appear to be looking at them. And that's just a function of the setup. Now, another thing this thing allows you to do is you can use a drawing tool on the screen. You can use a pen. Now, with a mouse, a pen is not that useful. A lot of the times when I do online discussions, I actually use a tablet PC, such as the Microsoft Surface. In fact, we require our students to use the Microsoft Surface in our Doctor of Business Administration program, and we supply them with it. Now, with a Surface, you can actually write on the whiteboard exactly the way you would write on a normal whiteboard in a classroom. And I really prefer that. But if you're going to do that, you probably do not want to have your webcam on, because as you're writing, it's going to look really, really weird. So uh, many people prefer to type on a whiteboard in PowerPoint, and you can certainly do that. And if you do that, uh, then you'll be fine. But beyond that, really, it's a lot like doing a regular case in the classroom. And if you have a bunch of prepared slides, obviously you can put them on PowerPoint. And if you're sharing your desktop, you can even make it go into slideshow mode, and that will allow you to display them as you're talking. So that depends a lot on how you're organized. But this is the basic philosophy that I would recommend when you're using a tool like GoToWebinar to do a synchronous case discussion. In case you've forgotten it, this is the same case reflection form that I recommend using for asynchronous discussions, and it works really well for synchronous discussions. One of the things that I do is when I've got a long class, and in many cases my classes go 4 hours once a week in face-to-face classes or in synchronous classes, then what I do is I make filling out this form part of the class. But there's no real reason that you have to. In an asynchronous environment, I will typically give them a couple of days to fill it out, just as I did with the asynchronous case. So it doesn't really matter whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, but you want people to fill these forms out, and you want to grade them carefully so that students realize that you're really paying attention to what they're saying. And they can be very, very interesting to read. So I'd like to wrap up the synchronous discussion with a few parting observations. The first of these observations is that the synchronous discussion can be conducted very similar to what you do in the classroom. I keep saying this over and over again because it's worth emphasizing. If you're new to online learning, and you're suspicious about what your students are going to learn, the synchronous discussion using a tool like GoToWebinar gets you about as close as you can to the classroom. It takes some getting used to, and the flip side of using technology is in a normal discussion you've got all your attention as a facilitator focused on paying attention to what the students said and who said what. When you start doing synchronous discussions, you're going to find the tool occupying a lot of your attention, at least initially. Eventually that goes away, but when you're getting started, it's going to fragment your attention and make it a little bit harder for you to facilitate the way that you want it to facilitate. There's a big investment in setup. From a technology standpoint, there's the time it will take you to learn the technology. The same is true with your students, and every semester you're going to have to go through the same exercise of making sure that everybody knows how to connect. You'll run practice sessions. 80 to 90% of your students won't have a problem, but 10 to 15% will take up a lot of your time trying to solve the problem. And in addition, after you think you've got it all solved, the next week somebody will come in on a different computer or on a different connection, and they'll have a whole new set of problems. And it won't be the majority of the class. It will typically be a small minority, and it may be a different minority every time. Even from time to time, I've run into some problems that I haven't expected. So it's not exactly perfect yet, but usually after 2 or 3 weeks, it's gotten down to a very acceptable level because you have problems in the face-to-face class as well. It can be very challenging to schedule. If you bill a class as an asynchronous online class and you tell them you've got freedom of place and freedom of time, when you try to schedule a synchronous discussion, you will always find a certain percentage of people can't make it. Now, you can get around that by recording the discussion if you want, but you can also find that if a synchronous discussion is optional, that people don't show up. And I had this experience in my class. I always ran an optional synchronous version of each discussion as well as an asynchronous version because I really thought the students needed that immediacy. Well, what I found is for the first couple of weeks, I got a lot of people showing up to the synchronous week discussion. By the fourth week, we had 3 people show up, and it was more like an inquisition than a discussion. And at that point, I said, okay, we'll just go back to the asynchronous, because the students really do tend to value that convenience and flexibility. One thing that's important to understand about online, and I think this is a real benefit, particularly if people are taking either a blended course that mixes online and face-to-face, or are taking some face-to-face classes and some online classes, you will often find that different people will participate in an online discussion than participate in the classroom. And this is even true of synchronous discussions. When I go on a synchronous platform like Illuminate, I often find that the students that I'm hearing from are different from the students who are speaking up in the classroom, because there is something very uninhibiting about being online where nobody can see you. By the flip side, for some people, there's something really exciting about being in a classroom where everyone can see you and you know everyone's listening to you, and they become less interested in the online discussion. At any rate, I think the ideal is to have a mixture of face-to-face and online courses, but don't assume that just because it's an online course, it will in some way be inferior. It will be different, and different participants will benefit from it in different ways. But nevertheless, it can be a good experience in every other respect. And then finally, and this is the thing, if you're going to be doing these online synchronous discussions, after you've done a bunch of them with a particular class, it ultimately will become very seamless. And towards the end of a semester where you do a lot of these discussions, you will go into your online tool, and as the discussion proceeds, you will actually forget you're doing it online. I mean, it will be that close to the classroom experience that you just forget and you don't notice the technology. And in a situation like this, the best technology is the technology that you do not notice. And that sort of concludes what I have to say about the synchronous discussions, and it also sort of concludes the formalized presentations of this workshop.